So in this module, we're going to cover debugging in Rider. Now, some of you might have used debuggers a lot already, and some of you might have never touched a debugger. This module should have something for you regardless of experience level. I'm going to start off showing the debugger's user interface and go through the basics of debugging, but in this module, I'll also show various other tips and tricks as we go along that you might not have come across even if you've been using Rider for a while anyway. So going back to this project, which in the last video about bookmarks we introduced, but it's this module I created this project for. So a quick reintroduction, we've got a web API project with a controller with 2 endpoints. You can get a list of podcasts either by genre, so you can specify a genre, or by search term. This calls into a service. So we've got up here, podcast service, and we've got get podcast by genre, and we've got get podcast by search term. I've intentionally done these as 2 separate methods because I wanted a for each loop and I wanted a link query to demonstrate some debugging things. Both of these get a list of podcasts from something called podcast source, which is over here. So we've got an interface and then one implementation, hard-coded podcast source. And to keep it simple, I've just got 3 podcasts in. My podcast, the Unhandled Exception podcast, Nick Chapsas's podcast, Keep Coding podcast, and a Kubernetes podcast. The genre, both mine and Nick's, is .NET. And for this one, I put Kubernetes as a genre. And there's also a test project, which just does an integration test and makes a GET request to that endpoint and verifies the status code. So super simple, and you can download this project to follow along. So imagine now we've got an issue and we want to debug it to find out what that issue is. Or you just want to step through the code and understand what it's doing. So first of all, to do this, you want to make sure that your project is using the debug configuration. And normally that's the default unless you change it to release anyway. But if you build your project in release mode, then it's going to do lots of optimizations, which makes debugging much trickier. We've already shown in this course this play button, and you can do Control F5 to just run your application. If you want to debug, you've got this button here. And whilst it says Alt and F5, you can just do F5. That's what I normally do. And if you're used to Visual Studio, F5 is probably quite familiar. As I've said before, though, it might depend on your chosen key mapping. It might be different. So if we run this now, I can do that or press F5. Then it opens this debug pane. And we can see on the left-hand side, this debug icon here has got a little green dot. So that indicates that we are currently debugging. And this is the debugging pane. If you're debugging multiple things at the same time, then you'll have multiple tabs here for the different things. So this might happen if you're running a Blazor application where you've got a front end and a back end. You can also, these configurations, which I've shown before, if you go to edit configurations, so these are the default ones we're running. You can do plus to do additional things. So you can see all of these options. You also have multi-launch, where you can add different configurations and launch them and debug them all at the same time. So this is handy if you've got like a microservice kind of architecture, or even just something that's got a front end and a back end, but different projects within your solution. So if you do that, let's cancel that, then you'd have multiple tabs here. And each tab has its own debugging window here with all its own different tabs. So one thing, if you're used to Visual Studio, you might be used to these buttons up here when you're debugging, using them to continue. Where in Rider, it's more down here while you'd be working or using the keyboard shortcuts. So that is a bit of a gotcha coming from Visual Studio, because habit would make you click up here. And I think they have improved it. When we stop on a breakpoint in a sec, there used to be a play button up here, which if you pressed, it would restart, which was very confusing for Visual Studio users because rather than continue debugging, it would restart the debugger. Basically what you wanted was this one here. So you'd click down here instead, which was quite a hard habit to get out of if you're a Visual Studio user. Now they have changed the play button, which if I was stopped on a breakpoint is up here. They've now changed that to continue because it probably confused a lot of people. So that is much better. But the point is generally you want to be down here or using the keyboard shortcuts. So we've got stop, pause. If you've paused somewhere or you've hit a breakpoint, you've got this play button here. We'll talk more about these step overs as you're stepping through your code. You can view breakpoints, clear all breakpoints. And if you do the ... there's a few more options here, including various debugger settings. These tabs, threads and variables, which is empty at the moment, but when we hit a breakpoint and stop execution, then we'll be using this very heavily. Console is the standard console output, which you also see if you don't debug. If you just run it, it would show this anyway. Debug output is if you do, like, say in code, debug dot write line. So it's any code that writes to the debug output. Parallel stacks is very useful. Again, we'll see that shortly. Modules shows everything that's been loaded, all the different modules as part of your application. I must admit, I never need to go in here. And tasks, again, empty. We'll see that shortly. So one of the key things you're going to do when debugging is actually stop execution in your code. So you can step through your code, you can look at variables, you can work out what's going on, because that's the whole point of debugging. If we go to one of our files, let's do podcast source. So this is basically the data layer. Obviously I'm hard coding it, but it might be calling Entity Framework or something. And if I click here, so I can choose, I can click here, and that does what's called a breakpoint. So that does this red dot. I can also use the F9 key to toggle. So now that we've got a breakpoint and we are debugging our application, then when our code hits this line, it's going to stop in the debugger. Now this is a web API project, so we need to submit a request to the API. When you create a web API project, it will also create an HTTP file. I'm going to talk about this later on in the course, but basically this can do an HTTP request, and you can do like query strings, different headers. You could have a body if it was a post request. It supports variables. But as I say, we'll dig into this later. All we need to know is we can click this play button or Alt enter, and it will make that request. Our address is localhost, so this is going to call into what we're currently debugging. So let's do that. Let's click on this. And we can see now it's hit our breakpoint, and this is lit up. We're in our threads and variables tab, and we can see different threads along the side. This is the one we're in. We can see the call stack. So this is the function I'm in. If I click on this or double click, then this is what called it. If I click on this, this is the controller that called that. So you can walk through how we got to the current place we've stopped. On the right hand side of the call stack, let's move that across. Then we've got the list of variables that are in scope. So like this is the current class. We've got podcast because we know it's here. It's null at the moment because we've not actually run this line yet. Generally, when debugging, you want to step through your code. So if we look down here, see this green icon? We can resume it, or we've got these options, step over, F10, step into F11. So that would step into a method. If you were on a line that did a method call, for example, if you were here, you've got step out. So if you're in a method and you want to step out of it. So as usual, I tend to use the keyboard shortcuts. If I want to go to the next line, I can press F10. So that's now stepped down. And you can see this yellow arrow here, which shows where you've currently stopped. So where the instruction pointer is. We can also see other useful information. You can see over here, we can see podcast count is 3. So at a glance, without having to look down here, we can look down here and expand this. But at a glance, we can see inline in our code, the values of it. And you can even click on it. So you can get a pop-up and we can start expanding these objects. And if it's a string, you can click on view and you get more of a, imagine this was multi-line text, quite a big text file. This is much easier to work with to actually see the whole thing. If it's something like JSON, it would be nicely rendered. And there's various other things we can do here, but we'll touch on those later. Whilst we spoke about stepping through, so I pressed F10 to step over. So I stepped from here to here, and we've got this instruction pointer. One thing that's quite nice, now I'm just going to collapse this to show you because my font's quite big. You can actually drag this to a different point of code and it'll jump up so you can then step through again. You can also do the opposite way, so you can drag it down and it'll just jump over. It won't run this bit of code. You've also got various different like little overlays. So here we can say skip to cursor. So that does the same kind of thing. It'll just jump without running this code. You've got this icon, which is run to cursor, which we'll get to here, but it will run this code. And as usual, we can see little hints for what the keyboard shortcut is. So if we get that pane back up, so again here, it's got this green icon, and this has brought this up. So we've already seen this local window, which shows the local variables. You can also right click and say add to watches. So that appears up at the top here. If I press the insert key, then I can just type something else and you get the IntelliSense, and you can even call methods in here. I won't do that now, but it's quite powerful. You can also do the same down here, which is called the immediate window. If I drag this up, I'm going to single step, so F10 over, so I've got podcasts. So here I can evaluate stuff. I can do podcasts dot, and I can even do link queries. So let's say where x dot genre equals dot net. And you'll notice that's actually added it to the watch window. I could have done blah equals, and we can see it's created a section with actual variables in there. If I get rid of this and type blah, I can interact with that variable. So this is really useful for just inspecting things. So we've spoken a bit about breakpoints, but we haven't covered this in depth. If we go back to where our breakpoint was, so we can either click here and we can see our breakpoint here. Or if you remember in the last section when we did Alt and 2, we saw this bookmark window. This also shows breakpoints. If we right click on our breakpoint, then we get a few options. You can disable them. I'll come back to this in a sec. You can add conditions. If I go to more, then we get more options. And again, we can see enabled and suspend execution. So by default, it will suspend, as we've already seen. If we untick this, we can do things like log a message or log the stack trace. Or you can do a more custom log based on an expression. You can do things like once the breakpoint's hit, you can automatically remove it. And there's various different options, including hit count. So you can say, based on these predicates, then you hit it when it happens. So for example, equals 500. Now imagine you've got a loop that runs lots and lots of times and you don't want to press continue F5 500 times to get to that iteration. Then you can do something like this. Or you can do a condition. So a condition allows you, in fact, let me escape this and create a different breakpoint. Let me close this and go to podcast service. And then let's go down to this one. So if I put a breakpoint here and let's continue this and then go back to my HTTP request and run this again, I'll get rid of this breakpoint and continue. Actually, that was the other one. I need to run this endpoint to get to that bit of code. So now we've got podcast title, and you can see that we can mouse over to see things as well. So if we go to podcasts, expand this, we can see we've got 3 podcasts in the list. And the first one is my one, the Unhandled Exception podcast. If I expand, let's use Kubernetes as an example. So if I right click on here, I can do it here or do more and do it here, a condition. And let's pull this down a bit. We can see podcast title. Let's go with that. So we can start typing podcast.title.contains, let's say kube. And you can see it's got a question mark here now. So if I just continue this, and then I'm going to run that again. So go to HTTP, run this HTTP call again, and it's hit this. But this time, if I hover over title, it stopped when that condition has been hit. And that's kind of the fundamentals of debugging. That's a lot easier to work out what's going on rather than littering your code with lots of console logs all over the place. Just to quickly give you an example of if I go to the controller and put a breakpoint there and then go back to the HTTP and run this. So it hits that breakpoint. And then if I press F11, then we can see that stepped into it. So that's the same as doing this button down here. I can then F10 through it. And you can see the overlays here for .NET, for the genre. We can see the local values automatically populated down here. And then we can carry on stepping through. If you find yourself jumping into somewhere you don't want to be, you can jump out with this step out or Shift 11. So that's kind of the basics of debugging. In the next video, we're going to do a few different tips and tricks that you can do in the debugger.